Now for some analysis. Peggy Noonan is a Wall Street Journal columnist, CBS News contributor, and the author of The Time of Our Lives. David Ignatius is a columnist with The Washington Post. Jeffrey Goldberg is national correspondent for The Atlantic. And Michael Gerson is also a columnist for The Washington Post. David, I'll start with you. You had three people there who are auditioning to be commander-in-chief. What did you make of it?
My strongest impression was that Jeb Bush did the thing he's got to do to survive as a candidate, which is to sound like a convincing commander-in-chief. I thought he gave a good account of how he would augment President Obama's strategy for dealing with ISIS, the additional things he tried to do, a no-fly zone, a more forward-leaning position with our special operations forces. I thought he was powerful in calling out Donald Trump. I thought that this was a moment in which he, went to the heart of the matter, that Trump is playing on people's fears. It's getting toward Bush's last chance. So my takeaway from that was, this is a person who, in this environment of anxiety and foreign policy concern, can speak to the country's worries.
Jeffrey, what did you make of the group?
Well, I would agree with that, except I don't think that Bush is penetrating in a way that, say, Chris Christie is penetrating on these issues. I would just jump to Ben Carson for 1 minute and say that he said something very sensible, which is that the solution to the refugee problem is in Syria. It's not in the United States or anywhere else. And we need to be focused on the fact that more than half of the population of Syria is not even in Syria anymore. Can't solve this problem without a Syrian solution. But on what David was saying, yes, there's some important ideas that are being put forward by Jeb Bush, by Chris Christie and others. The thing I'm struck by is that there's this buffet line approach. I'm going to pick a safe zone and a no-fly zone, and I'm going to get the NATO allies to do X, and I'm going to get the Arab allies to do Y. It's all highly theoretical, and each one of these options that everyone is talking about, they're incredibly difficult to pull off, and we haven't thought about the second and third order consequences of all these ideas.
Right. So quickly, David, for about 30 seconds, on this notion that McCain and Graham were talking about, the regional armies that would handle 90% of the ground troop operations. How big of a lift is that? I mean, how plausible is that?
It's a huge lift, and I think that was the great weakness in what McCain and Graham said. It's typical of them that they're on the scene, they're looking, they're reporting. That's really admirable. But our problem has been getting our Sunni allies to stand up. They're fighting a war now in Yemen. They're fighting a proxy war against their regional adversary, Iran. They're not focused on ISIS. So the distance that they have to travel to be the force that will fight with us and clear and hold Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul, long way.
All right, we'll be back with all of you in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm John Dickerson. We want to continue with our panel, which includes Peggy Noonan of The Wall Street Journal, David Ignatius of The Washington Post, Jeffrey Goldberg is with The Atlantic, and Washington Post columnist Michael Gerson is also here. And Michael, I want to start with you. Since the attacks in Paris, how, if at all, do you see the Republican race changing? There are a lot of people saying it's changed, but what do you think's really actually happened?
Well, I think some of them at least are pressing an important case. After Paris, we now have ISIS, which has shown the strategic ability to strike in Western capitals. It's solidified its hold on territory. It has affiliates or followers in 20 different countries. So I really identify with Senator Graham's sense of urgency here. We seem to have a strategy in place to have a 5-year defeat of ISIS. But maybe we need a strategy for a 1 to 2 year defeat of ISIS. It's correct, the president's correct that many of the things they're proposing are the same, but the difference is urgency and leadership.
Yeah. Did you get that sense of urgency from the men you heard today, or in general, do you get that sense?
No, I don't think anybody on the Republican side or the Democratic side communicates a sense that they know exactly what needs to be done, how to do it, and how it could all realistically happen. I heard the other day, I just throw this forth as an idea, Mike Morrell said, one of the things that can concentrate the mind when thinking about policy, when thinking about ISIS, is suppose ISIS hit the United States, as everybody fears. What would we all be thinking the next day was absolutely the right, urgent, strong thing to do? He said, maybe concentrate on the answer to that question
Right. So, David, do you know what that is? I mean, that would be preemptive action of some sort. And isn't that the tricky thing about that formulation is we would need the initiating event to get the country behind the action, it seems to me, that would be then required.
Well, he's saying use your imagination. What would that look like to us? And what would be the proper response at that point?
And do you think, David, the country would be behind such a thing?
Certainly, if we're hit directly, the public will support and even demand retaliation. I think there are two routes that we would follow in that case and should think about following now. One is to augment the direct action strikes that our special forces are already making every day inside Syria and Iraq. We are killing dozens of people who get back in touch with would-be attackers in the United States who come in on social media, and if you get a call back, if you're one of those people who's trying to direct an operation, we'll try to kill you. And so that's already going on. It should be augmented. Second, harder question is whether to add ground troops. I mean, for all the talk from McCain and Graham, there is not an Arab ground force that can clear Raqqa or any of these places reliably. Are we going to provide that? Will we do that with NATO, with a coalition of Arabs? Those are the kinds of questions that we would ask the next day and we should ask now.
And hold Raqqa, too, right? After you clear it, don't you have to do something with what happens afterwards?
And we have a lot of experience of, it's easy to take some of these Sunni Arab cities, as we learned in Iraq. It's also hard to hold them. And so I think, look, I have very little doubt that President Obama would be under huge pressure to insert ground troops in a major way and to take territory from ISIS, should, God forbid, there be an attack in America. I also know that he has a tragic sense of the difficulty of taking Raqqa and then doing something with it. You know, the first week, we have a victory. Second week, we're being attacked by Sunni militants. We've seen that movie over and over again. So the challenge is huge, which is why he, for many reasons, is hoping that he never has to face this question.
Michael, on refugees, Dr. Carson's plan that more can go into Jordan. What did you think of his?
Well, I think Republicans have hurt their ability to make critique by their relative indifference to refugees. I mean, we are seeing a situation in the Middle East, the massive betrayal of children on an unprecedented scale. Millions of children who are refugees in these circumstances. 10,000 dead in the country. You know, children who are forced to work or forced into early marriages. And the response of the administration, according to the special advisor that they employed for Syria, is he called it a pantomime of outrage. There should be a serious moral outrage at the problem here. Republicans can't provide that because they're conflicted about both the issue of Islam and the issue of refugees.
The issue, analytically speaking, I'm not making a moral judgment, but the issue is that Americans seem to be so tired of the Middle East. They want to cauterize an entire region. They don't want to hear about it or know about it and don't believe that anything we can do will actually make it better. And so that's the problem that any policymaker who's looking for any kind of intervention is facing.
A foreign policy person once told me that Americans think, when they consider foreign policy issues, they always think that's a Vietnam or that's a Munich. I think, do you know what I mean? The dynamic at play. I think when they think
bipolar.
When they think of the Mideast, they think that's Chinatown. That's where tragedy happens, no matter how hard we try to do the right thing.
But what's happening there is that young people are being put in the camps or in the refugee situations, being marinated in the outrage of their parents. We're creating generations of problems here. This is not just, we can ignore this. We're actually creating generations of violence here.
Well, is it reasonable to say, then let's get the Christians in Syria who are desperate, who want to flee, who are living in terrible conditions, let's get them over here. They appear to be people who are not infected with those who are vowed to blow us up. Is that reasonable?
There are minorities in general in the Middle East are in great peril. We saw that with the Yazidis. We've seen it with a range of minorities. I'd hate to just say Christians only are the ones we're worried about. John, I heard one thing today in your show that really surprised me. I heard from John McCain talk about candidates bloviating in this race. I heard from Ben Carson talk about hateful rhetoric that was hurting the country. And I heard from Jeb Bush how Donald Trump was preying on people's fears. It's the first time I can remember hearing on one show three candidates speak out against the tone in the Republican race. And maybe that marks a turning point.
Let me ask Michael about this. Donald Trump has offended a lot of different groups, and there's been a lot of controversy. This year, he operated in new ground, and he appeared, and we're going to watch here for a second, to make fun of a disabled newspaper reporter. And
this guy, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember.
Now, what I said. Trump denies that he was impersonating the reporter at the event. The the reporter, Serge Kovaleski, is with the New York Times, and he has a disability. Trump says he wasn't referring to him. But picking up on David's point, Donald Trump is wildly popular within the polling among Republicans. What's the state of things here?
Well, I think it's time, as some of the candidates seem to do, to confront not just Trump but his followers. There are people who buy this. It is fashionable in certain quarters to accept a kind of reality TV, shock radio, social media version of reality in which it is fashionable to attack people and groups in this sort of way. This is exactly at odds with what the founders talked about when they talked about civic virtue. Civic virtue, in their view, was restraint and civility, and all these things that undergird democracy are being undermined in this case.
30 seconds last to you, Peggy.
He's got 35%, it appears, of the Republican base. So that's a significant piece, but only a piece of the electorate. It seems to me everybody's always saying with Trump, that's going to do him in, that crazy thing he said, that's the end of him. It's never true, but at the end of the day, a cumulative effect and impression comes together, and in his case, it will not help him.
All right, Peggy, thanks so much. Thanks to all of you. We'll be right back with our panel of presidential authors. We're back with our presidential books panel. Doris Kearns Goodwin is the author of Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream. Longtime George W. Bush political strategist Karl Rove is the author of The Triumph of William McKinley. John Meacham's new book is Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. And Edward Larson, the author of The Return of George Washington. The Uniting the States, 1783 to 1789. He's also with us. Almost lost it there at the end. Let's talk about presidential attributes. We're in a season of electing presidents. Let's talk about each of your presidents and what they did that'll help us inform our choices this time around. Doris, start with you. What attribute from the presidents you've written about should we be looking for, prospecting for in these presidential candidates now?
Well, I think the first thing we need to figure out is whether they can master themselves and their own emotions. Have they been able to get through adversity? Have they come through trials of fire? Have they been able to manage their negative emotions? And then once they've grown themselves, can they grow other people? Can they inspire a staff? Can they make collaboration happen? Can they communicate with people in a way that the country is going to understand? And I really think that's what we should be looking at as we're dealing with this presidential candidacy. We've been dealing with polls and who's got more money and who says something stupid in a debate. Your question is exactly what we should be asking. We should look at our guys for guidance. They can tell us something, the dead guys.
Karl, you've written about the dead guys and you've been on the inside. So what in McKinley's life should we use to help us inform our thoughts today?
First, Doris was right. I mean, here's a man who was a unbelievably courageous individual in the Civil War, 3 battlefield commissions, suffered enormous personal tragedy in his life. And these, I think, informed his character. And in the campaign of 1896, he wins an election that's up in the air because he, first of all, he deliberately seeks to unite the country. His opponent is using language like the enemy's country, referring to the East, and attacking Wall Street, and excoriating the rich. And here's a man who is determined to help working class people rise in life, and he seeks a language that is conciliatory and unifying in his race, and thereby contributes a great deal to winning the contest. The other thing is that he wants to initially not engage on the biggest issue of the campaign. He wants to straddle it. And then he wakes up in the
This
middle.
is the money question.
The money question. He wakes up in the middle of August and realizes, I don't get to choose the issues. The voters get to choose the issues. And I've got to talk about that issue in a way that allows the people who are up for grabs in this election, working class laborers, to vote for me. And finally, he takes on the biggest pressure group in the country and confronts the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment, and thereby modernizes his party and creates a new governing coalition that lasts for nearly 4 decades after him.
The American Protective Association. John, give us an attribute that we should look for from George Herbert Walker Bush.
Prudence, stability. The fundamental political transaction in a democracy is, do we trust our fates in his hands or her hands? And George H.W. Bush became president, I think, because through a series of life experiences, he was able to convince enough people that he was someone who could be trusted at the helm. It was not a glamorous, he was not a glamorous figure. He was not the greatest of orators, I think is safe to say, but he gave off an ineffable sense of command. And I think that whether it was being the last president of the World War II generation, a series of jobs, almost impossible to imagine now someone with his resume getting even remotely through a primary. UN ambassador, envoy to China, chairman of the Republican National Committee during Watergate. What second prize? Director of the CIA, vice president for 8 years. He was a public servant who I think culturally and temperamentally had as much in common with the founding fathers as he's had with his own successors.
I want to talk about present day in a moment, but Ed, tell us where George Washington, I mean, my goodness, he seemed to have it all, but what would you pick in terms of something we should look for the fellows who are, and women who are running these days?
Well, he did have it all, and he characterized everything Doris said about the attributes of leadership. Washington exemplified. I always think of the C's. I think he was courageous, he was consensus, and he was a cautious risk taker. He was courageous in the sense he always led from the front, whether it was during the Revolution or as president. He led from the front. He didn't send other people out in front. He was in front. And as consensus, Doris, of course, famously talks about the team of rivals with Lincoln. Well, nobody put together a team of rivals like Hamilton, Jefferson, Adams, Knox, Randolph in the same group, because he wanted to pull a consensus together. That's how he led his battles. Every time before a battle, he'd call all his lieutenants together and get their advice, and then think about it and then make a decision. He made them all part of the team. And then courageous risk taker, which I think we need in any president. He was willing to take risks. Think of Trenton and crossing the Delaware, or Yorktown, and then as president, Jay's Treaty or other things. And the National Bank. He was a risk taker, but it was always cautious, and it was always by building a team first. And that's sort of how Washington made it work in a very difficult time. It's
Absolutely.
the same thing we need today.
You know, I think one thing I'd like to add, I think what you're looking for, they're all ambitious when they run for president, but is their ambition double? Is it for the people and accomplishing something that will stand the test of time? When I think about the risk that Lyndon Johnson took when he became president after Kennedy died, he made a priority to have that civil rights bill that would end segregation in the South passed. If he had failed in that, his whole presidency would have failed. He would have never been elected in November. Even succeeding, he knew that he was going to undo the South for a generation for the Republican Party. But he took that risk, and then once that ambition was fulfilled, then he wanted to go for voting rights, then he wanted to go for affirmative action, then he wanted to go for fair housing. When you feel that as a president, that you're really able to use that power to do something important, then you become a different person.
Let's talk about risk-taking for a moment. It seems like what we're talking about here is leadership. We hear the word a lot, but it's a little bent out of shape. John, what would you say in George Herbert Walker Bush's career? His son Jeb says basically that going back on his no new taxes pledge was a great symbol of modern presidential leadership. I don't know if you would pick that, but what moment would you pick that was a risk-taking moment where he really stepped up?
Well, in 1968, as a member of Congress from Houston, he voted for the Fair Housing Act, which lifted racial discrimination from the housing market. He had opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act that Doris mentions when he was running for the Senate. But once, in 1964, once he had power, he did the right thing. He consistently did that. The 1988 campaign was a hard-hitting race, But once he got to Washington, to go to Ed's point, he tried to seek consensus. He would have members of Congress come down and take pictures of them with a Polaroid one-step. It was the early selfie. No one used the residence, the horseshoe pit, the golf course, Camp David, as much as he did. To George H.W. Bush, life was sort of one long class reunion. Some of his best friends were Democrats, Lud Ashley of Ohio, Sonny Montgomery of Mississippi, Rosti. For him, the ambient reality of Washington was a more bipartisan one. And so when he faced tough decisions, he was able to make a consensus-based one. It hurt him with the right. It hurt him with his own party. He broke with the base of his party on Read My Lips. And I asked him once, I said, what's your regret in public life? And he said, shouldn't have said read my lips. So he was honest.
Not shouldn't have done the underlying deal, just the rhetoric.
Yeah. Is there a reason why you pointed to me when you kept saying the right?
It's always with great love.
Carl Grove, I want to go back to you on McKinley and the American Protective Association. Tell us what this is and why there might be a parallel with today's Republican Party.
First, one quick comment. We've talked about all these presidents Lincoln with rivals in Washington and so forth. The presidents have to have a certain amount of self-confidence and self-awareness. They have to be confident that they can command these different personalities, and they have to be self-aware that they're not necessarily and should not be always the smartest person in the room. And McKinley was like this as well. This is why he brought together the divergent elements of the Republican Party. But the example you ask about, the largest pressure group in America in the 1890s is the American Protective Association, which has nothing to do with protective tariffs. It is a virulently anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant group founded in Clinton, Iowa. It has millions of members. It plays a huge role in voter guides to tell people how to vote. And they declare in the 1896 campaign that one candidate alone is unacceptable on the Republican side, and that's William McKinley, because he's thought to be too close to the Catholics. McKinley is smart enough to know that the country's changing rapidly demographically, and that many of the new immigrants, industrial workers, are Catholics and not from the normal sources of immigration. They're not from the British Isles and from Germany. They're from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and Central Europe. And so he wants to modernize his party. He wants to win. And in order to win, he wants to get the vote of Catholic voters and of urban ethnics. And he goes out to do so by literally taking on the APA frontally, but in a very smart way. He doesn't call them names. He doesn't excoriate them. He mocks them. They say he's a member of secret Catholic societies, so his campaign puts out a list of the secret societies to which he belongs, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Loyal Union League, and a college fraternity. And he then, on the first day of the Republican National Convention, demonstrates that he's in command by not having the traditional invocation offered by a Protestant priest, but by inviting a Jewish rabbi to come and give the invocation, deliberately saying to the APA, in essence, I'm in charge, you aren't. And this coalition that he creates for 40 years has a significant number of Catholics and urban workers, and he's the first Republican ever endorsed by a member of the Catholic hierarchy.
Ed Larson, I want to ask you, you were talking about Washington's, that he was a cautious risk taker. I was struck when they're trying to convince him to come to the Constitutional Convention. He says that the train of evils must be sorely felt in the country. In other words, people maybe weren't up in arms about how bad the existing order was, and so he wasn't going to go yet. That's sort of smartness about political capital. Talk about that a little bit.
Washington was a tremendous retail politician. He knew people. He was dignified, but he wasn't aloof. And he had this sense about where the country was going. And he knew that in the years after the Revolution and before the new country, the building of the Constitution, that a stronger government was needed, because we needed a national market economy, and that required a central government that controlled interstate commerce. And we needed a strong country that could raise taxes and build a military, because we needed national defense. He showed the issues were economic progress and respect overseas, a strong military, national security. And he realized the country had to be ready to buy that, because the idea of a new constitution, which he strongly supported from the time of the Revolution, had to have popular support. Yeah. So how to bring the people together, and he knew he only had limited capital from the Revolution, so he had to wait till the time was right, so timing was right, and pull together a large consensus, and he would only go when he had a vision of what could happen. Cautious risk taker, taking the risk to have a new constitution, taking that, waiting for the right time, but building a consensus, and that's what he did.
Doris, you've written about presidents who have a good sense of timing. Do you see in our current political moment something that one of the presidents you've written about would kind of grab and say, this is what they would do?
Well, I think there's two things that two of the guys that I've lived with would do. One is FDR. I mean, think about how confusing ISIS is. We don't even know where they are. We can't figure out on a map where they are. In 1942, we were in a similar situation. We'd lost in Pearl Harbor. We had lost in the Asian theater. And he said, I want everybody to get a map in front of them for the fireside chat this weekend. And I'm going to point out to you why this is a different war, why it has different methods, why you have to care about what's happening in these far-flung parts of the war, because it's our security, and we're going to get through this. There was a run on maps unlike anything ever seen. C.S. Hammond's map store sold more maps in that week than they sold the whole year. Even the guy's wife, who never had liked maps, and he's been selling them for 50 years, said, bring me a map home. I want to watch what FDR is going to do, or listen to him. So I think we should do that now. I think we need to understand from our president where ISIS is. We need to look on our maps. We have to figure out where it is and what we can do about it and how it's going to affect us.
All right, well, we're going to have this conversation. It's going to continue online. Thank you all so much for being with us. There's a lot more I can talk about, and fortunately, we're going to do that right after the show. It'll be posted later on facethenation.com, and we'll be right back. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.